Case 10. Samantha Josephson. What was in her hand was not enough to save her. A brief note before this story unfolds. Unlike the other cases in this series, Samantha Josephson and Nathaniel Rowland did not have an online relationship. There was no Tinder match, no Instagram conversation, no weeks of building false trust across a screen. What connects her story to everything else in this series is simpler and in some ways more frightening. She trusted a digital platform to keep her safe, and a man made a calculated decision to exploit that trust in the few seconds it took for a car door to open and close. Technology brought them together. The lock on the door kept her from leaving. The rest is a story about what happens when a stranger decides your fate before you have any idea you were even in danger. She had her phone in her hand. That matters, and it will keep mattering throughout this story, because Samantha Josephson was exactly the kind of 21st century young woman who understood the risks of being out late in a city. She had ordered the Uber, she had the app open, she was watching for the car. When a black Chevrolet Impala pulled up beside her on the edge of the Five Points Entertainment District in Columbia, South Carolina, at roughly 2 in the morning on March 29, 2019, she did what made complete logical sense. She got in. The door closed behind her, and then she heard the locks click. Samantha grew up in Robbinsville, New Jersey, in a family that would later become known not only for their grief, but for the extraordinary purpose they poured into it. Her father, Seymour, and her mother, Marcy, would, in the months and years after her death, become two of the most visible advocates for rideshare safety in the country, founding an organization, lobbying lawmakers, and changing the law in South Carolina and beyond. But in March 2019, they were simply the parents of a 21-year-old senior at the University of South Carolina, a young woman studying political science who had spent a semester abroad in Barcelona, visited Madrid and Paris, and had already been accepted to Drexel University's law school on a full scholarship. She was 3 months from graduation. She had her whole career mapped out. She had her whole life ahead of her. Josephson spent the night before her death in the Five Points district in downtown Columbia with friends. At about 2 in the morning, she decided to leave the Bird Dog bar and ordered an Uber. According to surveillance footage, at 2:09, a black Chevrolet Impala driven by Rowland pulled up beside her. Josephson entered the vehicle, thinking it was her Uber driver. According to authorities, Rowland activated the child locks so that the doors could only be opened from the outside, trapping Josephson inside the vehicle. Nobody saw anything unusual. Nobody intervened. A young woman got into what looked like a rideshare car, the most ordinary act imaginable in a college town at closing time, and nobody had any reason to look twice.
Nathaniel Rowland was 24 years old, from New Zion in Clarendon County, and had no prior relationship of any kind with Samantha Josephson. Prosecutors told the court there was no evidence they had ever encountered each other before that night. What drove him to circle the Five Points area for 10 minutes before pulling up alongside her, surveillance footage later confirmed the circling, and what possessed him to trap a stranger in his car and drive her 65 miles into the countryside remains something only he fully understands. He maintained his innocence throughout the trial and did not testify. His attorney told the jury 0 of his client's DNA had been recovered from Josephson's body. The judge called it an avalanche of evidence, regardless. Using a 2-bladed knife, Rowland inflicted roughly 120 separate wounds upon Josephson. The pathologist could not determine an exact number because there were so many. Josephson's autopsy revealed the extent of her blood loss. The human body typically holds at least 4 liters of blood, but Josephson's body contained only 20 milliliters when she was found. She had fought back. A footprint was found inside the Impala, her foot pressed against the door in what the lead prosecutor described as proof that she had tried to get out. Her DNA was recovered from beneath Rowland's fingernails. She had fought with everything she had, in a locked car, in the dark, 65 miles from the city where her friends were still waiting for her to text back. The morning after the crime, Rowland was seen on ATM footage attempting to use Josephson's bank card unsuccessfully. His then-girlfriend later testified that he arrived home that morning without her work visor, and when she asked about it, he told her it was in the country with blood on it and to mind her own business. When police spotted his car 2 blocks from 5 Points the following day and pulled it over, he got out and ran. Officers found Josephson's blood inside. Turkey hunters discovered her body in remote woodland in Clarendon County the afternoon of March 30th. She had been left in a field, alone. The jury took a little more than an hour to find Nathaniel Rowland guilty of kidnapping and murder. Judge Clifton Newman sentenced him to life in prison without parole immediately after the verdict. He told Rowland that all roads, every speck of evidence, led to him. He said it was the most severe case he had presided over in his decades on the bench and described Rowland as heartless. Rowland told the judge he knew he was innocent, but that what he knew no longer seemed to matter. The South Carolina Court of Appeals upheld the conviction in August 2024. A second request for a new hearing was denied the following month. Since Josephson's death, her parents' advocacy has resulted in identification numbers being added to rideshare apps that match riders to the correct drivers, and South Carolina, along with many other states, now legally requires license plate numbers to be displayed on rideshare vehicle windshields. The family also launched the #Sammy movement, encouraging passengers to always ask their driver what their name is before getting in. Samantha Josephson had a phone in her hand and the right app open. She did everything that felt safe. The only thing that could have saved her that night was a locked door that opened from the inside, and the man behind the wheel had already thought of that.
Case 9. Wendy Duan. Her mother said no. There is a question that sits at the center of this story, one that does not have an answer and never will. Wendy Duan's mother saw the photograph. Her daughter held the phone up and asked, the way a daughter asks a mother, casually, hopefully, "Do you like him?" And the mother looked at the face on that screen, felt something she could not name, and said no. Just no. Not a lecture, not a list of reasons, just a mother's instinct responding to something invisible that the camera could not capture. Wendy smiled and kept seeing him anyway. 7 days later, she was in her backyard in Sugar Land, Texas, and she was gone. Is there anything more devastating than a warning that arrived in time and still could not save a life? How do you carry that? How does a mother carry that? Wendy Duan was 28 years old, a third-grade language arts teacher at Boone Elementary School in Houston's Alief Independent School District, where she had been teaching since graduating from the University of Houston in 2017. She had been on the dean's list of the College of Education every semester between 2015 and 2017. She was a first-generation success story, a young Chinese-American woman who had worked hard, built a career, and earned the kind of professional recognition that most educators spend a decade waiting for. Just 1 month before she was killed, she had posted on her Facebook page about winning ESL Teacher of the Year for the Houston Area Association of Bilingual Educators, writing that she had kept telling people there was no way she would win, especially going against teachers who had been teaching far longer. She was 28 and already leaving a mark on every classroom she entered. Every Thursday, without fail, she stopped at the dollar store on the way to school and bought small gifts for her students. Nothing expensive, just tokens, just her way of saying she saw them. In late December 2022, Wendy connected with Charvas Thompson, 26, on the Meet Me dating app, and the two had been seeing each other for only about 1 week before everything ended. There is very little publicly confirmed detail about the nature of their brief relationship, whether it was serious or still forming, whether there had been conflict before, or whether January 7th arrived like any other evening. What Sugar Land detectives concluded after investigating the scene is that Thompson shot and killed Wendy during an argument. At 9:50 in the evening on January 7th, 2023, police responded to a reported shooting at the 1100 block of Oxford Mills Lane in Sugar Land. They found Wendy Duan in her backyard. She had been shot multiple times. A neighbor named Tony Thomas heard it happen. He described 4 very distinct gunshots that came out of nowhere, so startling that he dropped everything he was doing and came outside immediately. The subdivision was the kind of quiet Houston suburb where gunshots at night do not belong in the soundtrack. The kind of neighborhood where a teacher could buy a house, put down roots, and feel safe enough to have someone over. That sense of safety did not protect her. By the time police arrived and secured the scene, Charvis Thompson was already gone. He had not gone far in terms of the country, but he had put more than 260 miles between himself and Sugar Land by the time investigators caught up with him. On January 11, 2023, 4 days after the shooting, Thompson was detained in Louisiana, where he was taken into custody in connection with the murder. An arrest warrant had been issued charging him with murder, with bonds set at $500,000. He was in the process of being extradited back to Texas to face charges in Fort Bend County. What makes this case sit differently from others in this series is not the violence, though the violence is devastating. It is the timeline. 7 days, a week. Less time than it takes most people to finish a library book, less time than a school week feels when you were the teacher staying late to grade papers. Wendy Dwan gave a stranger 1 week of her attention and her kindness, and it cost her everything. Her mother had looked at his photograph and said no, her instincts firing clearly and immediately. Her mother had looked at his photograph and said no, her instincts firing clearly and immediately. That same mother, speaking after the arrest, said she believed Thompson had taken her daughter's kindness as a sign of weakness. She said she hoped he received the full weight of legal punishment. She said it was unbelievable. The word keeps appearing in this case, unbelievable, because the people left behind keep reaching for language large enough to hold what happened, and nothing fits. The Aleph Independent School District issued a statement calling Wendy's passing a tragedy and asking the community to hold her family in their thoughts. Her students at Boone Elementary lost the teacher who bought them dollar store gifts every Thursday, the one who showed up for them in small ways that added up to something large over time. The classroom that was hers sat empty. The awards on the wall remained. The children who had voted for her, cheered for her, watched her accept a Teacher of the Year honor just weeks before she was killed, returned to school without her. Charvis Thompson's case in Fort Bend County has proceeded through the court system, and as of the time of this writing, the case remains in the legal process. Wendy Dwan deserved decades more of Thursday dollar store visits and classrooms full of children who needed exactly the teacher she was. A mother's instinct was right. The warning came too early and too late at the same time, and that is the kind of grief that does not resolve.
Case 8. Ashley Pegram. The message he sent after she was already gone. There's a moment in this story that stops everything. Not the crime scene, not the shallow grave in the woods near Harleyville, not even the electrical tape wrapped around her wrists and neck. The moment that stops everything is a message sent at 3:29 in the morning on April 4, 2015. It came from a Kik account called eMoney Bon, and it read, "Hello, you still awake? Just making sure you made it home. Sorry I left you at the gas station, but you were too drunk to handle." Ashley Pegram's family found it the next morning when she hadn't come home. They read it with relief. Maybe she was fine. Maybe she was somewhere sleeping it off. What they did not know, what the man who sent it knew with absolute certainty, was that Ashley was already dead. He had dug the grave himself. Ashley Nicole Pegram was born in April 1986, a South Carolina native who grew up in Somerville with a kind, outdoorsy spirit her family said was simply who she was, not a performance, just her nature. She was 28 years old, a mother of 3 children, and lived with her parents on the evening she left home for a first date she had been looking forward to. She had no car of her own, so her date had offered to pick her up, something she had mentioned to her family beforehand, the way a person does when the plan feels ordinary. Nothing about the evening of April 3rd felt alarming. A bonfire at her date's brother's house, a few drinks, a ride home afterward. That was all it was supposed to be. Around March 15th, Ashley had met Edward Primo Bonilla on the online social site Meet Me, and the two had spent the following month messaging each other through the app Kik. Bonilla was 30 years old at the time, employed at a flooring company in the Hanahan area, and gave no obvious outward signs of violence. When he arrived at Ashley's parents' house in a Hyundai Sonata just before 9:30 in the evening on April 3rd, she got in the car and they drove to the bonfire together. She asked him to bring beer. He agreed. It was a first date that looked, by every surface measure, completely fine.
What Bonilla told the jury at his August 2016 trial was that things went wrong on the drive home. He said Ashley had been drinking, grew agitated, and accused him of stealing her mother's phone. He said he stopped the vehicle so she could use a restroom, that she got out and started fighting with him, and that he put her in what he described as a bear hug or chokehold to restrain her. He told the court he never intended to take her life, that everything was happening too fast, and that she simply stopped struggling and fell to the ground. He said it was his fault, but not intentional. It was the story of a man who had spent weeks constructing the architecture of an alibi before he ever needed to use it. What the physical evidence said was something else entirely. Ashley's body, when found, showed fractures in her neck consistent with manual strangulation and blunt force trauma to her head. She was found with electrical tape wrapped around both her neck and wrists. The lack of tissue in certain areas of her body suggested she had been subjected to further harm before her death. A muscle relaxer was found in her system. A tube of personal lubricant was recovered from Bonilla's work van. Her blood was found in multiple locations, in the trunk of his mother's car and in the van he used for work. The prosecution told the jury plainly, nothing about what Bonilla described explained how Ashley's blood ended up on the ceiling of his van. After she died, Bonilla went back to his apartment, retrieved his work van, returned to where her body was, placed a plastic bag over her head, wrapped her neck and wrists in electrical tape, and drove to a wooded area near Harleyville where he dug a shallow grave and buried her. He then drove home, waited several hours, and sent the Kik message to her phone, knowing it would be read, knowing it would buy him time, knowing her family would spend the night believing she was somewhere safe. When her family reached him the following morning, he told them he had left her at a mobile home park, then later at a gas station. His story shifted each time someone pushed back. Investigators found his account so inconsistent that they arrested him first on obstruction charges before the murder charge was formally filed. It was Bonilla himself who eventually told his attorney where Ashley was buried, a disclosure that became part of the trial record and, ironically, one of the most damning pieces of evidence used against him. Cadaver dogs located her body on May 9, 2015, in a wooded area near Harleyville after a 2-day search of the location Bonilla had disclosed. Her family learned she was gone the following day, Mother's Day. Edward Bonilla was found guilty of murder in August 2016 and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge called both the killing and the burial brutal. She said she had nothing in her professional vocabulary adequate to describe what had been done to Ashley Pegram and the family left behind. He stood before the court and praised the American justice system. He showed no emotion when the verdict was read. Ashley Pegram was a mother of 3 who shared a phone with her family. She left home excited for the evening. She left behind 3 children who grew up without her and a family that found out she was gone on a day meant to celebrate mothers.
Case 7. Gordon Semple. Some stories resist the ordinary language of true crime. They arrive at a place where the facts themselves carry a weight that no dramatic framing could improve upon, where the details are so stark that the only responsible thing a storyteller can do is lay them down carefully and let them speak. This is one of those stories. It begins on a Tuesday in South London, on a day that happened to be April Fool's Day 2016, a coincidence that, in retrospect, feels almost unbearable. And it ends with a man answering his apartment door in pink underwear and aviator sunglasses, greeting 2 police officers with a confession so matter-of-fact it stopped them cold in the hallway. Gordon Archibald Semple was born in Inverness, Scotland, in June 1956, the kind of man who moved south as a young person and built a quiet, steady life in London. He joined the Metropolitan Police in 1983 and spent over 3 decades in service, eventually settling into a role with the Westminster Antisocial Behavior Unit, a job focused on protecting the safety of the public he had sworn to serve. He lived in Kent with his partner of 25 years, Gary Meeks. By all accounts, he was a trusted officer, a devoted partner, and a private man. He was 59 years old on the last morning of his life, and by most measures, the afternoon ahead of him looked ordinary. He had a meeting at the Shangri-La Hotel inside the Shard. He had a phone in his pocket, an app on it called Grindr. Stefano Breezy was 50 years old, Italian-born, and had spent years constructing a life that looked, from the outside, entirely respectable. He had studied at the University of Florence, moved to London in 2012, and landed a well-paying job as a web developer at Morgan Stanley, earning roughly £70,000 a year. He had 2 degrees in philosophy and computing. He was articulate and, by most accounts, socially capable. What was happening beneath the surface of that life was a different matter entirely. In 2013, Breezy became addicted to crystal meth, which eventually cost him his job by February 2015. As his grip on ordinary life loosened, he moved toward things that filled the space it left: Satanism, increasingly extreme online communities, and a fixation on a television drama called Breaking Bad, in which a character dissolves a human body in acid. He watched it, he later told a support group, to try to manage his cravings. It did not work the way he intended. On April 1, 2016, at 12:30 in the afternoon, Gordon Semple left his meeting at the Shard and made his way to Breezy's flat at the Peabody Estate in Southwark, South London, after the two had connected on Grindr. What happened inside that flat over the hours that followed became the subject of a weeks-long trial at the Old Bailey. Breezy claimed Semple died during a consensual encounter involving a restraint around the neck that slipped. The prosecution's pathologist was direct in their rebuttal. The manner of death was consistent with strangulation, but the process would have taken several minutes, not the instantaneous accident Breezy described. The jury, after deliberating for more than 30 hours, returned a majority verdict of guilty.
What made this case genuinely singular, what caused the judge to tell the court that no amount of professional training could have prepared officers for what they encountered, was what Breezy did over the 7 days between Gordon's death and his discovery. Inside the flat, police found flesh in a bathtub filled with acid, bags containing bones, and parts of Semple's head. His DNA was found on kitchen utensils and a blender blade. Bite marks were identified on a recovered piece of bone. One of his legs had been burned. Remains that could not be destroyed were thrown into the River Thames. A foot was later discovered by a member of a mudlarking club near Bermondsey Wall. A knife and 4 black candles were found beneath Breezy's bed, and a copy of the Satanic Bible was recovered on his computer. He was sentenced to life in prison in December 2016, with a minimum of 24 years. The judge told him that the regret he expressed in court had to be understood alongside what he had done over those 7 days. On February 5, 2017, just 8 weeks after sentencing, Stefano Breezy was found dead in his cell at HMP Belmarsh. He had been placed on suicide watch days before sentencing after the judge raised concerns. Letters to family members and a handwritten will amended 2 days before his death were found in the cell. Gordon Semple was loved by his partner and his family. The judge said it plainly in court, and it is worth saying again here. He was a man who had given decades to protecting other people. He walked into a stranger's flat on an April afternoon, and he'd never walked back out.
Case 6. Ingrid Line. What he did after the baseball game. She had arranged a babysitter. That detail, small as it sounds, carries the full weight of what Ingrid Line's life looked like on the evening of April 8, 2016. She was a 40-year-old divorced mother of 3 young daughters who worked long shifts as a registered nurse and still found the energy to get dressed up for a date on a Friday night. She had circled that date on her calendar. She had made the calls and arrangements that every single parent makes when they want just a few hours of something that feels like their own. She went to a Seattle Mariners game with a man she had been seeing for about a month, a man named John she had met on Plenty of Fish. What happened between that stadium and her home in Renton is the kind of thing that the judge at sentencing said she wished she could hand down life in prison for, and the maximum the law permitted simply was not enough. Ingrid grew up in Tucson, Arizona, graduated from the University of Arizona with a nursing degree in 1997, and relocated to Washington State in 2000. She built a life in Renton, raised her daughters with her ex-husband Phil, and continued working at Swedish Medical Center in Seattle, where colleagues described her as devoted and compassionate. Her ex-husband later told the court she was his co-parent and sounding board, and that the hole she left was not one that closed. Her daughters, Noelle, Brooke, and Reese, were 10, 8, and 6 years old when she was killed.
John Robert Charlton was 37 years old at the time and presented himself online in the way that people who have very little do, selectively, with just enough to seem plausible. He was, in reality, a homeless day laborer with a criminal record in 6 states, including convictions for aggravated robbery, felony theft, grand theft auto, assault, and third-degree larceny. On his Plenty of Fish profile, under the profession field, he had written student/aquatics. Ingrid had no way of knowing any of this. The platform did not tell her. Nothing did. They attended the game, went to a bar afterward where Charlton drank heavily, and then returned to Ingrid's home in Renton. That is the last confirmed sequence of events that both of them experienced together. What followed is known entirely through physical evidence, because the man who caused it claimed he remembered almost none of it. Charlton told police he was so intoxicated that he could not recall how he and Lynn returned to her residence after the game, or what happened when they got there. He said he assumed they had relations. He said she seemed strange. Beyond that, he offered nothing. He claimed he woke up the next morning on a sidewalk in downtown Seattle, which is where detectives later found Ingrid's 2015 Toyota Highlander, a vehicle he had also taken without permission after she was dead.
The alarm was raised on the morning of April 9th when Phil Line arrived at the house to drop off their daughters and found no one home. Ingrid's wallet, phone, and personal belongings were all inside. Her car was missing. Her mother, Jorga Bass, used a shared phone account to locate the last number Ingrid had been in contact with, texted it, and received a response, "My name is John. I thought she was with her kids today." That response, investigators would later note, told them everything about the kind of man they were looking for. A resident near 21st Avenue in East Pine Street in Seattle called 911 on the afternoon of April 9th after discovering 3 plastic garbage bags in his recently emptied recycling bin. He tipped them onto the grass and saw what was inside. When investigators searched Ingrid's home on April 10th, they found a 15-inch pruning saw near the bathtub and blood and flesh in the bathroom drain. The pruning saw was consistent with what a medical examiner later determined had been used on her body. An empty box of plastic garbage bags was found in her kitchen, identical in make to the ones recovered from the recycling bin. Additional remains were found in a second location in the days that followed.
Police noted that when Charlton was interviewed after his arrest, he seemed nonchalant and appeared annoyed when asked about Ingrid's disappearance. He was arrested on April 11th, 2 days after her remains were found. Investigators were troubled enough by the specific nature of the offense that the FBI assisted in reviewing other potential victims connected to him. That wider search did not produce additional charges. In October 2017, more than a year after the crime, Charlton entered a guilty plea. At sentencing in January 2018, King County Superior Court Judge Julie Spector told him she would lock him up for life if she could. She could not. She sentenced him to 27 years and 9 months, the maximum the state's sentencing guidelines permitted. The judge described the offense as vicious and cruel beyond belief, and noted that what he did after Ingrid's death made everything worse. Phil Line looked at Charlton in that courtroom and said simply, "You have taken someone who was not yours to take." A GoFundMe established for Ingrid's 3 daughters raised over $270,000. The girls still miss their mother every day. Case 5. Kelsey Turner, The Last Trip to Las Vegas.
He had entertained his patients with magic tricks for 4 decades. He was a child psychiatrist who had spent his professional life making frightened children feel safe, watching their faces shift from anxiety to something close to calm the moment he performed a small trick with a coin or a playing card. By the time Thomas Burchard reached his early 70s, he had semi-retired, cutting his work week to 4 days so that his longtime patients would not lose the continuity of care he had spent years building with them. He was generous, he was trusting, and somewhere between a phone screen and a Las Vegas street, those two qualities became the most dangerous things about him. Thomas Kirk Burchard grew up to become one of the more quietly respected figures in Salinas, California. He spent over 40 years in psychiatry, built a practice, and by most accounts, lived a full and steady life. His girlfriend of 17 years, Judy Earp, later described him as someone who sent money to women he met online, a habit she knew about and worried over, a soft spot in an otherwise measured man. Over a period of several years, Burchard had been financially supporting Kelsey Turner, a model who went by the Instagram name Bad Barbie and had built a visible following on social media, appearing in magazines including Playboy Italia and Maxim. According to Earp, Burchard had given Turner around $750,000 over the course of their arrangement. He paid her rent first in Salinas, then in Las Vegas. He paid bills. He covered expenses. In return, Turner kept him attached to the idea of her.
What Thomas Burchard may not have fully understood was that the house in Las Vegas where Turner lived also housed her boyfriend, John Logan Kennison, and a roommate named Diana Pena, and that the financial arrangement between Turner and Burchard had begun to collapse badly in the months leading up to March 2019. Earp later told a court that Turner had printed checks at home using Burchard's name and account number and had made numerous online charges against his accounts, effectively stealing money after he attempted to cut off the payments. Prosecutors would later suggest Turner was also concerned Burchard had the means and motivation to report her behavior to authorities, which could have threatened her custody of her children. Whether it was the money, the exposure, or a combination of both, the situation had reached a breaking point, and Burchard had no idea. His last words to Judy Earp, spoken just before he boarded a plane to Las Vegas in early March 2019, were, "She's such a pervasive liar that I have to see for myself." He never came back from that trip. Las Vegas Metropolitan Police were called to a suspicious vehicle near Lake Mead at around 9:30 in the morning on March 7, 2019. A man driving through the area with his children had spotted Turner's blue Mercedes-Benz sitting alone on a desert road with a rock thrown through one of the windows and called it in. When officers approached the vehicle, the smell told them something was wrong before they even reached the door. Thomas Burchard was found in the trunk, beaten to death. The Clark County coroner determined he had died from head injuries caused by an unspecified blunt object that left a pattern distinctive enough for investigators to link directly to a specific weapon, and he had several defensive wounds on his arms, indicating he had tried to protect himself.
A baseball bat was found in the trunk alongside him. Towels matching others inside the house on Amigo Street were wrapped around his body. When investigators arrived at that house, they found blood in the garage, cleaning supplies staged nearby, and evidence of a hurried departure. The 3 residents, Turner, Kennison, and Pena, had already fled to California. The roommate, Diana Pena, ultimately provided what would become the most damaging account of what happened inside that house. She testified that Kennison struck Burchard with a bat, and that when Turner saw what was happening, rather than stop it, she told Kennison to hit him again. Kennison later pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder in June 2022, receiving a sentence of 18 to 45 years in state prison. Pena received probation for her role as an accessory after she cooperated with prosecutors and provided testimony that proved critical to the case. Turner, after 3 years of maintaining her innocence and facing a full murder trial, signed an Alford plea in November 2022, acknowledging that the evidence against her was sufficient for conviction while declining to formally admit guilt. She was sentenced on January 10, 2023, to between 10 and 25 years in prison, with eligibility for parole after 10 years. She was tearful in court. She did not make a statement. Thomas Burchard was a man who spent a lifetime helping people feel less afraid. He walked into a situation his girlfriend had warned him about, driven by the same trusting instinct that had made him a beloved doctor for 4 decades. His patience in Salinas waited for him to return. He never did.
Case 4. Mackenzie Luck. He had already decided before they even met. Consider what it means to plan something before you know anything about the person on the other end. No argument, no history, no grievance, just a decision made in cold blood about a stranger whose only crime was responding to a message. That is the most unsettling truth buried inside this case, not the fire in the backyard, not the shallow grave in a canyon 85 miles from Salt Lake City, not the neighbors who smelled smoke and thought nothing of it. The most unsettling truth is this. According to his own defense attorney, Ayoola Ajayi had already decided to take Mackenzie Luck's life before she stepped off the plane. She was 23 years old and she never had a chance, not from the moment she typed the first message. Mackenzie Luck was the kind of person people instinctively gravitated toward. She grew up in El Segundo, California, the second of 4 children, a natural athlete who swam competitively and played water polo in high school. She later moved to Salt Lake City for university, majoring in kinesiology and pre-nursing at the University of Utah, where she joined the Alpha Chi Omega sorority and spoke with academic advisors about eventually going to medical or nursing school. Her sorority sisters remembered her as a nurturer, the one who made sure everyone at the table had something to eat, who checked in without being asked. Her plan was to graduate in May 2020. She never got there.
In the months before her disappearance, Mackenzie had created a profile on Seeking Arrangement, a platform that presents itself as a space for financially comfortable men to meet women willing to exchange companionship for monetary support. She was, by her own account, comfortable with the arrangement and had reportedly navigated it without incident until Ayoola Ajayi created his own profile on the same platform. Mackenzie messaged Ajayi on June 16, 2019, sending him a simple question mark, to which he replied with the words "seeking arrangement" and a photo of himself. It was one of the most ordinary exchanges imaginable. It was also the last ordinary moment of her life that she would control. On June 17, 2019, Mackenzie flew back to Salt Lake City from El Segundo, where she had been attending her grandmother's funeral. She landed in the early morning hours, took a lift from the airport, and was dropped at Hatch Park at around 3 in the morning. She told the driver she was meeting a friend. Security cameras captured her stepping out of the vehicle and being met by a man investigators would later confirm was Ajayi. Her phone was switched off 1 minute after her last text message, and it never came back on. The Lyft driver was the last person other than Ajayi to see her alive. What happened at Ajayi's home on Fair Park Drive was later described in court by his own defense attorney. After they returned to his home, Ajayi bound and strangled Mackenzie, then burned her body and buried her in his backyard while police and loved ones searched for her. Before leaving to meet her at the park, he had deliberately disabled the recording function on his home security system. He had also, months earlier, approached a contractor about building a soundproofed hidden room beneath his front porch, fitted with wall hooks and secured by a fingerprint scanner. The contractor turned the job down. He had also written and self-published a novel in which 2 characters are killed and set on fire. The book was later removed from Amazon. When investigators knocked on Ajayi's door during the missing persons search, he looked the detective in the eye and said he had never seen Mackenzie Luck before. Police later traced the Text Me app number she had last been in contact with back to Ajayi and also found that he had recently created a profile on Seeking Arrangement. A cadaver dog brought to his property during the search warrant execution responded almost immediately to a disturbed section of the backyard. Charred remains were uncovered. The remains of some of her belongings were pulled from the Jordan River. After his arrest, Ajayi told his attorneys where the rest of her body was, in Logan Canyon, nearly 90 miles north, in a shallow grave beneath trees just off the main road. Her arms were bound behind her back with a zip tie and rope.
Ajayi pleaded guilty in October 2020 to aggravated murder and desecration of a human body. The plea removed the possibility of the death penalty. Prosecutors told the court that no conventional motive, financial gain, revenge, personal conflict, existed in this case. Their conclusion was that Ajayi simply wanted to know what it felt like to take a life. This was described as murder for murder's sake. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, with additional consecutive sentences for the forcible assault of another woman he had met through a dating app in 2018, a victim who came forward only after recognizing Ajayi's face in the news coverage of Mackenzie's disappearance. Mackenzie Luck's mother stood in court and called her daughter a true spitfire, a woman with plans, with people who loved her, with a graduation date already circled in pencil. She was meeting someone she had only recently connected with online, and somewhere across that city, the man who had already decided her fate was driving to the park to make it happen.
Case 3. Grace Millane, the birthday she never got to have. There is a particular cruelty in the way this story holds its timing. December 2, 2018 was Grace Millane's 22nd birthday. Her family in England had been sending her messages since midnight, expecting responses from the spirited, fearless young woman who had been texting them faithfully throughout her travels, sharing photos of sunsets in Peru and Christmas trees in Auckland. She never replied. Not because she was asleep or caught up in celebrations or somewhere without signal, but because by the time December 2nd arrived, Grace was already gone. Somewhere between one Tinder match, one evening of bar hopping in a city she had only just arrived in, and the interior of a hotel room on Queen Street, the rest of her life had been taken away. Grace grew up in Wickford, Essex, in a family that described her as naturally warm, naturally curious, and completely comfortable with the world. She studied advertising and marketing at the University of Lincoln, graduated with a degree, and did what many young people with a sense of adventure do after finishing university. She bought a backpacking ticket and kept going. 6 weeks through South America, then New Zealand, then the plan was to keep traveling. She arrived in Auckland on November 30th, 2018. She had been in the country for exactly 1 day when she matched with Jesse Shane Kempson on Tinder.
Kempson, who was 26 at the time, had constructed a very specific version of himself for public consumption. He told women, colleagues, and friends elaborate lies, that he had cancer, that he was a senior manager in the mining and supermarket industries, that he had connections to gangs and the police, and that his cousin was a famous all-black rugby player. He was, in reality, a man deeply obsessed with online dating, pulling in women one after another, weaving false identities around each of them like a trap made of words. What nobody in Grace's orbit knew, and what a New Zealand court order would ensure the public could not learn for years, was that Kempson had raped another woman he met on Tinder 8 months before Grace ever matched with him. That case was deliberately kept from the jury hearing the murder trial to ensure a fair process. The picture only became complete much later. On the evening of December 1st, Grace and Kempson went bar hopping in Auckland's Central Business District. CCTV footage showed them kissing in a nearby venue. At 9:41 in the evening, cameras captured the two of them entering the City Life Hotel on Queen Street arm in arm. That was the last confirmed footage of Grace Millane alive. What happened inside that hotel room became the centerpiece of one of New Zealand's most followed criminal trials. Kempson's defense claimed Grace died accidentally during a consensual activity involving pressure on the neck. Prosecutors told a different story, one shaped by what Kempson did the moment after she died.
The hours that followed her death said everything about premeditation versus panic. After Grace died, Kempson carried out internet searches about how to dispose of a body and also viewed pornography. He then went on another Tinder date the following afternoon, roughly 24 hours after Grace had last been seen alive, before purchasing a suitcase from a nearby store. Security footage showed him wheeling that suitcase out of the hotel. On December 3rd, he drove to the Waitakere Ranges, a forested area west of Auckland, and buried it in a shallow grave beneath dense bush. He also searched online for information about flesh-eating birds native to the region. Later, he rented a carpet cleaning machine from a supermarket. Grace's family reported her missing on December 5th, 3 days after her birthday, when she still had not responded to any of their messages, behavior her family described as completely unlike her. Police identified Kempson as the last person to have any contact with her through her Facebook profile. When initially interviewed, he told officers they had parted around 10 in the evening and that he had not seen her since. The CCTV footage from the hotel destroyed that account entirely. On December 8th, during a second formal interview, Kempson admitted to Grace's death, but maintained it had been an accident. Her body was recovered the following day.
The murder trial began in November 2019. The jury of 7 women and 5 men deliberated for 5 hours before returning a unanimous guilty verdict on November 22nd. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum non-parole period of 17 years in February 2020. He has since filed multiple appeals, all of which have been dismissed. The courts additionally convicted him of raping and assaulting 2 further women he met through Tinder, offenses for which he received 11 additional years, to be served alongside his existing sentence. Grace Mullane's mother, Jillian, told Kempson in her victim impact statement that her daughter had died terrified and alone in his room. Her father, David, who traveled to New Zealand and made an emotional public appeal during the search for his daughter, passed away from cancer in November 2020, just weeks before Kempson's name was finally made public. He never got to see the man named. Grace's family later asked the world to speak Grace's name instead of his, choosing to remember the young woman who set out to see the world, rather than the man who ensured she never finished seeing it. Case 2. Sydney Loof, the date she never came home from. Most people swipe through a dating app in the same way they flip through television channels, casually, curiously, searching for something that feels right. It is one of the most ordinary things a person can do in the modern world. Sydney Loof did it on a Tuesday, matched with someone who seemed interesting and agreed to a second date. She even documented it. Before leaving her Lincoln apartment on the evening of November 15, 2017, the 24-year-old posted a Snapchat photo of herself, smiling, caption reading, "Ready for my date." That image would become one of the most haunting in Nebraska's criminal history. Not because of what it showed, but because of everything that happened the moment after it was taken. Sydney grew up in Arcadia, Nebraska, a small-town girl who loved fishing, played basketball and golf in school, and later moved to Lincoln, where she worked as a cashier at a local Menards store. She was described by those who loved her as warm, a little restless, still figuring out the next chapter. She dealt with anxiety and depression quietly, the way many young people do, scheduling a doctor's appointment just days before she disappeared. Her family drove her to that appointment. It was the last time they saw her.
The woman on the other end of Sydney's Tinder match was Bailey Boswell, then 23 years old, described by witnesses as charismatic and magnetic, the kind of person who pulled people in without much effort. Boswell was in a relationship with Aubrey Trail, a man 35 years her senior, who witnesses said had recruited her and shaped her worldview into something darker and more calculated than most people who knew her early in life could have recognized. Trail, who spent much of his youth in foster care and juvenile facilities before landing in prison as a teenager, had developed a fixation on power, control, and what prosecutors would later describe as a desire to bring other people into a criminal and sexual underground of his own construction. Sydney and Boswell went on a first date on November 14th. By all accounts, it went well enough that they arranged to meet again the very next evening. What Sydney did not know was that on the day of their second date, Trail and Boswell were at a Home Depot in Lincoln, purchasing tools and supplies. Security camera footage later confirmed this. What made that footage particularly significant was what investigators determined from the timeline. Sydney was still alive when those purchases were made. The apartment in Wilbur where Boswell brought her that night had been rented for 6 months. Trail was waiting inside, reportedly behind a makeshift enclosure of tarps designed to contain evidence. The planning was not impulsive, it was deliberate and thorough, which is perhaps the most disturbing part of everything that followed. Trail later acknowledged to investigators that he used an extension cord to end Sydney's life. He offered several conflicting explanations over time, that it happened during a sex act that went wrong, then later that Sydney had become a threat to their lifestyle and he acted out of fear she would expose them.
Prosecutors built their case around a simpler and more complete picture that Trail and Boswell had targeted Sydney specifically, had chosen her because she lived alone and was romantically interested in Boswell, and had prepared for the crime in advance. The judge who sentenced Trail would later say he had selected Sydney for characteristics that made her, in the killer's estimation, an ideal target. Trail later acknowledged to investigators that he used an extension cord to end Sydney's life. He offered several conflicting explanations over time, that it happened during a sex act that went wrong, then later that Sydney had become a threat to their lifestyle and he acted out of fear she would expose them. Prosecutors built their case around a simpler and more complete picture that Trail and Boswell had targeted Sydney specifically, had chosen her because she lived alone and was romantically interested in Boswell, and had prepared for the crime in advance. The judge who sentenced Trail would later say he had selected Sydney for characteristics that made her, in the killer's estimation, an ideal target.
Case 1. Polly Likens. There is something uniquely devastating about a child who was never supposed to be in danger finding themselves precisely there, in the dark, waiting for someone they trusted to arrive. Before the news alerts, before the search parties, before the grief descended on a small Pennsylvania town like a fog that would not lift, Polly Likens was just a 14-year-old who loved Fortnite, Pink, and the idea of one day becoming a park ranger like her Aunt Liz. She lit up every room she entered. She made people laugh without even trying. And on the night of June 22, 2024, she walked out of a friend's house in Sharon, Pennsylvania, into a world that had no intention of letting her come back. How does a 14-year-old end up on an adult dating app at 3 in the morning? That is a question without a clean answer. Grindr, the platform at the center of this case, is designed for adults, and yet Polly Likens found her way onto it, and so did the man who would take her life. Deshaun Watkins was 29 years old at the time, a resident of Sharon who worked at a local grocery store. To his neighbors, he was quiet, unremarkable, the kind of person you pass in a hallway and forget within seconds. Nobody saw what was coming, because people rarely do.
Surveillance footage from that night tells a story that words struggle to carry. A figure believed to be Polly was captured on camera at Bud Street Public Park near a canoe launch along the Shenango River, pacing back and forth, phone in hand, looking like someone waiting for a car that was late. Her cell phone signal went dark at around 3:40 in the morning. That was the last time technology had any trace of her. The living, breathing girl behind the signal was already gone from the world's reach. When Polly's father reported her missing on June 25th, police were also responding to a call about something found at the Shenango River Lake in Mercer County. What they discovered there was the kind of thing that changes the people who find it. The Mercer County coroner later confirmed that the dismembered remains recovered from the lake and surrounding areas belonged to Polly Likens. She had been killed by sharp force trauma to the head. She would have turned 15 on July 6th.
Investigators moved quickly. Camera footage from Watkins' apartment complex told a damning story. On the morning of June 23rd, Watkins was seen leaving his building carrying a large, apparently empty duffel bag. He returned less than half an hour later, struggling with that same bag, now visibly heavy and difficult to manage. He set it down in the hallway, clearly straining. Later that day, he purchased a power saw. By the next morning, June 24th, he was making several trips out of his apartment, carrying multiple bags and garbage bags, heading in the direction of the reservoir. When investigators later searched his apartment, they found traces of blood in multiple locations, including beneath the bathroom flooring. The saw was recovered, but one of its exchangeable blades was missing. Some of Polly's remains were never found. Watkins was detained on July 2nd as he returned to his residence. Police noted a bandaged cut on his hand. When questioned, he acknowledged meeting someone through Grindr who matched Polly's description, but claimed his memory was too poor to recall specifics. It was a claim the evidence made very difficult to believe. He was arrested and charged with first-degree criminal homicide, abuse of a corpse, aggravated assault, and tampering with physical evidence.
Prosecutors later added a count of involuntary deviant sexual intercourse, a charge that arose directly from Polly's age.
Mercer County District Attorney Peter Acker, a man with 46 years of legal experience, described this case as one of the most serious he had ever encountered in his career. The LGBTQ community across the country responded with grief and with urgency, pointing to a broader pattern of violence that had already claimed the lives of at least 18 transgender individuals in America in 2024 alone. Polly's mother believed her daughter's killing was motivated by hatred of who she was. Investigators said they could not rule that out. Deshaun Watkins has remained in Mercer County Prison without bond since his arrest. His trial, delayed multiple times, is now scheduled for March 10, 2026. If convicted of first-degree murder, he faces life in prison and potentially the death penalty under Pennsylvania law. Polly's favorite color was pink. She wanted to spend her life protecting nature. Instead, a child who deserved decades ahead of her was taken in the early hours of a summer morning, at a park, waiting on a stranger she had no way of knowing she should have feared.